Hello there. I wanted to go through this article because I saw it a couple of days ago, and it's a bit old now, but when I saw it, I kind of got a bit frustrated by it for a couple of reasons. One, as the title suggests, fantasy settings are staler than moldy bread right now, which, if you don't necessarily like how fantasy games are today, then that's totally fine. But I take issue with some of the essentialization of it, like this specific settings are essentially bad or something like that. And also this sort of weird desire that originality should be valued over just something being well done. And to me, I just completely disagree with that. I don't necessarily care if something's original or not. I care if it's well done. If it's original, I mean, that's pretty cool as well, but it's not really the main motivating force, because I think oftentimes that if originality is the driving force, you're going to learn the wrong lessons from things that are, that have been done over and over again. It's not that it is bad, it is that you just have to do it well, and that's the thing that you have to look for if it's done well. So, but yeah, let's just go through the article. Time to kill off the elves and get weird. You know what, elves, sure, a bit pretentious lot, but the imminent launch of Baldur's Gate 3 has filled my head with thoughts of elves and dragons with enchanted swords, all of which I've realized I'm utterly exhausted by. My tolerance for fantasy inspired by European folklore and Tolkien has entirely run out, leaving my wishing game developers would delve into weirder places to look for new muse. Now the thing is I don't necessarily dislike the sentiment that you want to see different kinds of fantasies. That's certainly fine. My issue is that more of to abandon them completely, which is a bit weird. It's for example, when boomer shooters were king of the days, right? There were so many boomer shooters no matter what, right? And then you had new ones and people like those, and then Call of Duty inspired games just took over, and now people like boomer shooters again. It's this weird loop that's thing I like is good, now there's too much of that thing, I don't like it anymore. New thing comes out I like, now that thing that I liked there's too much of, and new thing that it's this weird cycle that I don't really think is productive. It's just if you don't like it because there's too much of it for you personally, that's certainly fine, but I don't think throwing the baby out with the bathwater is a good idea. Baldur's Gate is, of course, beholden to an existing universe, one of the most familiar ones, so the main stays are inevitable. But the world of Toriel, where the Forgotten Realms are situated, is one of the least exciting locations in D&D, especially when compared to the wonderful mess of the plains or the void between worlds that plays host to Spelljammer campaigns. Give me some cosmic fantasy. So, Spelljammer, from what I know, is pretty silly in its art style, in its sort of tone, and that's fine, but the thing is, I think you can have both, right? I don't think you have to have either or. That said, Larian deserves credit for still embracing the other side of D&D, the focus on mind flayers and body horror, the introduction of characters like the Dark Urge, and of course having sex with a druid using the Wild Shape spell, ensure that Baldur's Gate 3 stands out. The studio is clearly having a lot of fun within this otherwise conventional setting and trying to push it unusual directions. The thing is, I don't mind unusual directions, I don't particularly care about that, but the thing is, I want it to be good, right? And that word, right, when people say I don't mind if something's original, I just want it to be good, is not me saying I'd rather have something tried and true. It's me saying that I don't care if it's original. Being original does not, or being unique does not make it better. It is not a mark of quality for me. It has to be good. It can be original and good, and I'll think it's good. The primary thing that I like is that it is good. But we are still inundated with the overall familiar, where even the most celebrated of fantasy games feel ostensibly conservative, tickling off dazzling array of ancient tropes. And that's another thing, right? Who cares if ancient tropes are existing in a specific game or movie or whatever, right? Again, the core thing is that it has to be good, right? Because something being original or something being tried and true does not make it good, it's how it's done. Traditional fantasies isn't inherently shit. I'm always going to be fond of dwarves, and not just because they're frequently presented as Scottish. It's just that there's so many games, films, and books ended up retelling the same stories. One as old as Lord of the Rings, which itself owes a huge debt to folklore. That is true, but again, I don't really think that's an issue, right? You can choose and pick and choose in what you want, and obviously this is supposed to be a sort of how do you say, prescription that of an industry should do it, because obviously within an industry, right, there are obviously trends that are done over and over because it's a much more tried and true. Companies can bank on the fact that a Western fantasy will do well rather than a fairly unusual fantasy, and I can get that, I can get that. But I still don't think that's the right mindset you should have. You should have the mindset of, well, we can have everything, we can have both. Their impact has been dramatically lessened by oversaturation and an overzealous fixation on racial traits. Elves are haughty, dwarves are taciturn and greedy, orcs are bad and dumb. Now, I do think this has somewhat changed quite a bit. Elves, in a lot of media, or at least specifically the biggest video games I could think of, The Witcher and Dragon Age, don't have like haughty elves. The Witcher has haughty elves, but those are the elves that are like space wizards, but the rest of the elves, they're more lowbrow, more common tongue type of individuals. They speak like that, they act like that. And for Dragon Age, the elves don't have a huge empire anymore. They're just in the slums, mistreated and poor and whatnot. I think that's more of a common trope nowadays than the elves being haughty. The only ones I can think of that are very big is like Warhammer Fantasy and like Warhammer 40k, Age of Sigmar as well. But like I don't think that's a common trope anymore. I don't know. I feel like elves being haughty is much more of a novelty thing now than it was before, because there's so many elves that are just like treated like shit. As dwarves being taciturn and greedy, I mean, yeah, sure, it's true, but it's less pronounced nowadays. Especially when it's pulling from D&D. D&D has done a lot to sort of smooth out a lot of the races, and they're not like essentialist. Orcs, I think, in one of the newer, not additions, but newer material for D&D, is that orcs aren't inherently bad. They're just in situations that promote bad habits, type of things. So I don't think that's particularly true. It's one of the reasons I still cling to Morrowind, a land where people lived inside carapaces in a volcanic desert, where wizards fall from the sky, and where public transport is dominated by large, adorable bugs. And it's proof that you don't need to toss out every single familiar element just to make a place feel alien. You still got your prophecies, lots and lots of elves, schools of magic, but it never stops being delightfully weird. Now, I like Morrowind, I like the aesthetics of it, I think it looks and feels very different. But the thing is, you can have both, right? You don't have to have an either or, you can have all of that. Unfortunately, Bethesda ended up going in the opposite direction. When it followed up Morrowind with Oblivion, a big European forest, and Skyrim, okay, the thing is, with the different sort of settings, in the Elder Scrolls, it makes sense, like, culturally and geologically, right? Like the, what was it, Cyrodiil was just Rome, okay? It was Roman Empire. If you look back at Arena, Daggerfall, and even Morrowind, right? What Cyrodiil looks like and feels like is basically just Rome, right? And obviously, lore-wise, it was a jungle, but then turned not into a jungle. Whole lore complication, but is mostly because I believe the developers just didn't want to do a jungle, and I kind of have an issue with that. But it makes sense for why it looks like a fantasy, like a European fantasy aesthetically. And for Skyrim, right, it's literally home to people called the Nords, okay? It makes sense for them to look like that. And I don't really think this is a good point to make, because it's not like Bethesda was forced into, or like forced this European fantasy setting into existence. They just went into a region, saw what the region's culture identity was and inspiration was, and then went with that. Like, I imagine if they do a Black Marsh one, I think they would have to do it like sort of an Aztec Mayan aesthetic, because that makes sense for what we know about the Black Marsh, what material we've seen. Same with Hammerfall with the sort of Arabia influence, right? It would have to be like that because it makes sense for the region. And yeah, I don't think this is a good point to make. I didn't suddenly kick the series to the curb, but my enthusiasm for exploring these locations ever reached the heights of my journey through their predecessor. Now that's the thing, right? Like if you really do value originality as like a marker of quality, then I think that's such a low amount of games you're going to enjoy, because eventually there'll be no games you'll be able to enjoy, because any new game that feels original to a lot of people will just be influenced by something that came before, right? And like I just don't really think that's a great place to great idea to have, because it eventually forces you to say, well, no game is good anymore because all games are generic and pulling off from something before. I've seen the light, and generic fantasy ceased to float my boat. For those looking for a mix of classic fantasy and lots of novelties, Shadowrun has a lot to offer. The tabletop setting, which has inspired a variety of video games, including the excellent Shadowrun Dragonfall and Shadowrun Hong Kong, splices a European fantasy and elves and orcs. Now, the thing is, like, that's fine and whatnot, but if that is what, like, it's like, wow, this game is good because it's a fantasy but cyberpunk, which is like, sure, like, okay, like, it's fantasy but cyberpunk, but is it any good, right? Like, and that's the issue with the sort of making originality the marker of quality, is that if it's just even slightly different or slightly unique, suddenly it's good, even though it's a bad game. Like, not saying either Shadowrun game is bad, just saying that that's not really a great way to determine if something's good or not. Big corporations run the show, but they exist in a world where magic is very real, and where they might be hacked by a cybernetically enhanced dwarf. The combination of cyberpunk and traditional fantasy results in a unique concoction with plenty of surprises bubbling to the surface. And that's the thing, right? Like, if it's cool because you can see these two things fuse, I think that's pretty cool, right? But it also has to be well done, you know? It can't just have these things and then like, well, it's good now, isn't it? Even more than science, sci-fi, or fantasy, allows creators to eschew the rules of reality, where anything can make sense if you give it enough context. But it often feels like developers want to make fantasy settings even more familiar, escapulated by a trend of tackling issues affecting the real world, like how the plight of Dragon Age elves mirror the real world bigotry and colonialism. Let me just continue reading. Now, fantasy has always had some real issues, like Lord of the Rings critiques of industrializations, and that shouldn't stop. This kind of grounding can help us easily make sense of these fictional places. But when it's combined with so many other tropes, it leaves me desperate for some escapism. I'm not sure. I think it's fine. My primary motive is, like, if it makes sense for the world to tackle those issues, right? I think if you make a fantasy world where there's like literally no bigotry, and the only thing is like dudes fighting other dudes, and one of the dudes are just inherently evil, and you're just fighting it in like a huge big battle, right? And that's the demand. I think that's fine, right? But Dragon Age has always been at its core trying to be political, you know? David Gator famously didn't make the Darkspawn because he liked them. He was forced to make the Darkspawn. The whole Grey Wardens and whatnot existed because someone forced him to make that. He didn't want to do that because he wanted Dragon Age to be focused on its politics, you know? Not like a good versus evil battle with zombie orcs. And I think that's fine. like it's fine if you're complaining that like you don't like some of these combinations, because sometimes you just want some fantasies that are a bit weird and escapist. But also, it's weird that you pointed out Morrowind, because Morrowind is not like an escapist fantasy, like, at all. Morrowind is like very depressing, with the whole like slavery of Argonians, Khajiit, with, what was it, Half Telvanni, this like anarchist, like anarcho-capitalist group, like hellscape that they live in, and it's like, I don't know, it's a bit weird. I'm not sure if that's intentional or if that was just an oversight or whatever, but it seems a bit weird to say that. Okay. Failbetter's Fallen London setting, which spawned Sunless Sea and Sunless Skies, is perhaps my personal favorite example of a world that strikes the perfect balance between familiar and alien. It has all the trappings of Victorian London, but a Victorian London that dragged beneath the ground by bats, which sits next to hell, where devils were once bees. It is at all times unhinged and surprisingly now boasting multiple games full of indescribable horrors and oddities. And again, here's the thing, Ryan. Are these games good? Is Sunless Sea and Sunless Sky good? Or are they just good because they don't do what other games do? Like, that's the big issue that I'm still having here. It's like, whether or not these games are good, Ryan, it seems irrelevant to this person, to some other people, because what's the main priority is, does it feel different from other things? And that's not like, that doesn't mean good, you know? At the time when Lovecraft is touchstone for so many video games, Failbetter instead looks to its elite writers like China Miéville, whose weirder tales are even more bizarre and unsettling, but without the preserved racism. Okay, so like, I haven't played Sunless Sky or Sunless Sea, so I'm not necessarily sure, but like regardless, they had to take influence from Lovecraft. Lovecraft is the progenitor to all of this, and whether you not like the racism about it, you cannot just say like, oh yeah, so this person, right, China Miéville, like, did something different from Lovecraft without the racism. Like, no, they pull from the same source of the unknown, indescribable realities beyond, behind the shadows type of thing, you know. I think that's a weird thing to say. I was reading Miéville's Pedro's Street Station recently, and there's still nothing like it. Instead of elves casting spells, you've got scrab-headed women making art out of fruit and saliva, murderous beluched moths who can get you high from their excrement, and a dog possessed by a sentient hand. With every chapter, there's something new to wrap your head around, but rarely does it ever go too baffling. Okay, the thing is that I have an issue here as well, is that, like, that's fine, but what is the purpose it's trying to serve, right? I don't really, like, originality, right, for me, doesn't really matter, because I always have to ask, like, what is the purpose of a thing, right? What is it supposed to do? If is the intent of that? Because, like, and I think that's the sort of thing that originality sort of fails at, is if you try to be original constantly, you'll eventually stumble into the fact, like, you're like a pick-me, right? Like, pick me, pick me, pick me. I'm different than the other people. Which is like, sure, but are you trying to be different? Like, are you just, are your interests just not aligned with other people and therefore you are different? Or are you trying to artificially be different? And that's what I take issue with a lot of these, like, originality is like a mark of quality, right? Like, they have to, and that's why I don't really mind most fantasy games, right? Because if they do it well, because the intention is to do a fantasy thing well, then that's cool. But if they want to do something different, and that's their intention, and that's their goal, and they do it well, then that's great, you know? As long as the intention is fully realized, then I think it's pretty good. That, I suspect, is a fear of many developers when crafting settings. I don't think it is. I just think they don't want to make those sort of games. The people who are saying, if we go too weird, will players get confused, are executives who've never played a video game in their life. They're people who look at, like, some weird, artsy, abstract thing that the developers are making and go, I'm not sure I get this. But they don't want to say they don't get it, so they're just going to say, like, will people get this? I wonder. It's not the developers, it's the executives. And additionally, and if it's not the executives, it's just the developers not wanting to do so. It doesn't have to always be that some developers are just too afraid to make things weird. No, it's just that some developers don't want to do that. Like, it's not that complicated. For the likes of BioWare and Bethesda in particular, they're interested in something with a broad appeal. Yeah, but that's not bad, right? And additionally, like, well, I mean, not really additionally, but just broad appeal is fine. If you want to make a game that a lot of people like, that's fine. Like, that isn't bad, you know? When you enter a world heavily inspired by old fantasy tropes, you immediately understand it, okay? Instead of spending ages swatting up on esoteric lore, you could just start stabbing stuff with your enchanted sword. Again, how is that bad? Right? Like, nothing in this, all this is just a description of what some of these things are. I think BioWare is a bit different, but because I think they were the pioneers, at least with Mass Effect, with a lot of broad appeal because they pushed that into that direction. Bethesda is a bit different, because like with on the surface level you can kind of sort of like, oh, so the Nords in Skyrim, so the Skyrim, they're Nords, they're Vikings, okay, they have like, they worship gods, you know, they worship this god who became, or this man who became a god called Talos. Okay, cool, I get that. But when you get into the deeper, more esoteric stuff, then it's much more of a rabbit hole. I don't really think these are applicable descriptions, or these apply to these two companies, BioWare and Bethesda. But again, like if it were the case, you know, why is it bad, right? Why does it have to be such like weird esoteric lore? Because again, like if every single developer's aim is trying to be original, no one's going to be original because they're going to try stuff that isn't going to work because they're just trying it without really understanding why they're doing it. They have to have a purpose for doing the esoteric lore stuff. It's not just confusing stuff to just do for no reason. It has to have a purpose. But I'm convinced developers can have their cake and eat it too. I mean, like, I don't like, because what it's basically implying here is that, well, you can be like, you know, broad appeal, but also have esoteric lore, which is true, right? But in the way that I think their intentions are, it's not, I think, right. Let's see. Just look at the success of Elden Ring, a game where the narrative is anything but explicit, and you make friends with heroic jar full of blood, wine, whatever that is. And now it is baffling, but that didn't stop a vast number of people from becoming obsessed with it. Okay, with a lot of From Software games, they're popular because the internet hasn't really had any big influencers basically say, yo dude, what if bad actually? And there's been some attempts by some people, but it's never really stuck because it's been such a common meme and talking point that From Software game is just good for so long that the conversation can't change now. And that's not me saying that From Software games aren't good, they are, but that you can't really have the same sort of, how do you say? You can't have the same sort of discussion that other games have, right? For example, with Bethesda right now, you will have a lot of people who will put more doubt into them, who will come within a much more of a doubtful mindset. But yeah, again, want to say that Elden Ring's fine, it's a cool game, but like, the point is the gameplay, right? Not the narrative or anything and the esoteric lore. Again, like, Elden Ring is far away from a game that would be made by BioWare, right? It is not just the more odious oddities that I just really want, though. It is a new experience. It is new experiences. At the very least, it's time. It's about time for more fantasies to leave Europe behind. The well of European folklore as well has really dried up. Not really. I mean, like, we haven't done a lot for like the Holy Roman Empire. That sort of aesthetic hasn't really been done. Not a lot of French-inspired games have been done. Spain, not a lot of that. Not a lot of the Balkans. Now you could say The Witcher 3, but The Witcher 3 is different because it's one of the biggest games, talked about ever. So a lot of people have that cultural touch point. But a lot of people will be aware of that. But it still hasn't been like fully explored, right? Because The Witcher isn't all of Polish culture. That's kind of dumb to think that. So there's still a lot to go by. And again, you can have these older, more tried and tested tropes with newer, weirder stuff. They both can exist, you know. That's why I'm excited about the Wakandu Chronicles, an Afro-fantasy MMO inspired by African mythology. I mean, I think that's pretty cool, right? But I think it's cool in the sense of like, it's cool that they're using a different aesthetic for it, but I don't think it's cool because, wow, it's original, you know? If it's bad, then it being original did not make it better, you know? And it's intriguing beyond the setting, promising a world where players are fully in control, even playing the role of NPCs with emergent quests. I mean, that sounds interesting, right? Yeah, okay, I mean, that's it, right? Again, like, the whole article, I don't like that much, because again, you can have both fantasies that are like European inspired, English mythology and stuff like that. You can have that while still having weirder and odder stuff. The statement isn't, well, we can only have one thing and now we have to keep constantly shifting to new original stuff, even though it's sometimes not really good, but like it's good because it's original, right? No, I think the video game industry should have much more weird stuff, but for a purpose, right? If there's a developer like over here, like Fail Better's games, right? I think it's cool that they make this kind of stuff. I think it is pretty cool, but they made it with a purpose in mind. They were doing it not because they were like, oh, let's just do something different because we want to be different, unique, pick me. They were saying like, so we wanted to make a sort of Lovecraft horror inspired game about you exploring the seas. So like the whole setting is that London has like fallen into the ocean, fallen underground into this like black abyss, and now with eldritch beings and monsters, and now the player has to go around doing missions and whatnot. Not a main quest or anything, just going around experiencing everything. And the horror will come from you going from place to place, not knowing what's going to happen, and seeing weird and odd monsters. You know, like that purpose was explicit. Not because we wanted to be unique. It was we wanted to do this thing, and it's trying to do our best to accomplish that. And I think that's a better mindset to go within it, you know. And like this article, I can get the sentiment, but I don't get like the reasoning behind it, you know. I also just want to go through the comments because I think some of them are pretty interesting. So and because some of them agree, some of them disagree, some of them I think is also just wrong, but in a different way. So with this one, leaving Europe behind is not a very convincing solution regarding the lack of originality in fantasy themes. I don't see why anything should be left behind. That can provide sources of inspiration, which European history and folklore certainly provides plenty. I do agree with this paragraph that that there is still a lot to explore, but I don't agree that it's the like this is. Because this person still sort of agrees with the fact that like originality is preferable to like something tried and true. The whole point in a search for originality shouldn't be start to avoid specific ethnic influences in exchange for other ones, other than being self-restrictive in creative terms. It sounds like a terrible invention for further politicization for game development. I have no idea where this guy's coming from. So instead of focusing on excluding certain ethnic influences, let's rather focus on what we can additionally. I do agree that we should add things, not remove things. But I still dislike the whole point of in search for originality. Because like, if you constantly keep trying to look for something original, you're going to find out that you're making something different just to be different, not for a purpose, right? It has to have a purpose, and if it so happens to be original and not a lot of people did it or did it that certain way, then whatever, right? But not an explicit looking for originality by avoiding doing what other things are doing. That's not a great way to go about it. The great artists and writers of history have proven time and time again that you can take a cliche concept that has been done 1,000 times before, yet turn it into a unique masterpiece if only the creativity is there. Those artists and writers did those things because they wanted a specific point being going across, not because they wanted to flip the script on a cliche topic or a cliche concept, right? It wasn't that. Like what was it? Don Quixote, right? That one was written with the explicit purpose of criticizing chivalry, the concept of chivalry, and that wasn't, and that's pretty unique, you know. Like, not a lot of works about chivalry at the time were about that. But the guy didn't, like, when he was sitting in his room, like, I want to make a thing about chivalry, but I don't want to be like those plebeians and make something that's already done 1,000 times. What if chivalry, but bad? No, the guy went into it thinking chivalry is a dumb concept, and I hate these stories that portray chivalry as something that's like not what it is, right? And I'm gonna write a story that is that. That is why the guy did it, and not because he was like, I wanted to do something, but then flip it on its head. No. It sounds like you're taking his example too seriously, and it's triggering your so-called fear of polarization, yada yada. I agree that seeing the same elves and orcs are boring as hell. Not many companies do anything interesting with it. Dragon Age is super awesome, but the aesthetic itself isn't winning any awards. So forget about the fear of other cultures, okay? So this guy's just saying like, took this what is it over here? Which I mean this definitely informs a lot about this guy's thinking, you know. So I think that is warranted. But yeah, let's but as for the other comment about like Dragon Age, I mean that's fine, but like it looks good, you know. Is there truly cool stuff in other mythologies outside of Europe? Yes. Has the well of European mythology ran dry? Absolutely not. What feels stale is Tolkien's take on European mythology, but he's not the only source we have. Again, it's still doing this whole thing of like, well, I agree that originality is good, but like European mythology still has some originality in it, which I think is still failing to understand what the broader issue here is, which is trying to explicitly go for originality is a dumb idea. I've never seen Mori in a game. Size-shifting fae that lives in rocks near waters that rule over a realm of the dead inside of the earth. When threatening, they can grow to giant sizes. What about Scolomancy and the Demon School of Magic, where vampiric students learn to ride dragons and control the weather? The flesh-eating Therion mares, the sunken cities of Botanic and Cornish mythology, the little man who yearly battles with the invasion of the great cranes, the Absurp Cyclops, who live in the great mountains that are home to the king of the winter. Okay. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree there's a lot of cool stuff, but again, like, and that would be cool to see this stuff in games and whatnot, but the issue here is still, if someone wants to make something, they have to make it for a reason, not just because they have fear that someone's going to point to, someone's on the internet's going to say, you're not original, that's been done before. I don't think that should be the primary motivator of why someone does something or not. One more comment. Over here. I completely disagree here. Yes, you have a shit ton of Vantex on the European / Tolkienish fantasy games, standards on games, but you can count on one hand the good and interesting ones that really delve into the genre instead of cheap generic Tolkien copy 3726537263. I love medieval-ish fantasy and also like weird faraway places like Morrowind, but more as that outlandish exception. Give me more knights, castles, mages, dragons, and temperament forests, but make it more in-depth and interesting with its own unique twist, like the Elder Scrolls series or The Witcher does. Again, still think it's failing to understand that like if you as a consumer want to go find these unique things, that's fine, right? But you shouldn't be doing it to the detriment of like the media, because a lot of the reasons why artists make something that's more unique isn't because I want to be different from other things. It's more like, well, I think I want to do this thing, and like the people who are making Morrowind, like I want to do something that's like Middle Eastern, Sumerian inspired. I think that would be a cool concept to do, and they went with that, right? They went with that idea, not because, well, we're not like the boring people who do medieval European fantasy. We're the cool people who do something weird and strange. And that's not how it works. That's not how it's made. And I think that's very important to know. But yeah, but yeah, I mean, I think overall, it's a fine enough article, but it's still like it doesn't address what I think is the primary concern, which is you shouldn't be like looking for originality to the detriment of like quality, you know. Just because something's original doesn't mean it's good. It's just original, right? That's just a state of being, you know. That's not a state of quality. And I'd argue that if more games sort of took this idea of like trying to do something, a concept well, that a lot of games will be better. Because like, I don't know, man. I think it all can exist coexist at the same time. We can have weird stuff. We can have tried and true stuff. We don't have to pick and choose, you know. And yeah. Anyhow, if you thought this is fine, tell me about it, and yeah, recommend anything else that you would like me to talk about as well. I'd love to see.